All right, I am on the line with Paolo Bacigalupi, if you could say hello.
Hi, how's it going?
So Paolo and I actually did see each other in person just a few weeks ago at the Williamson Lectureship,
Yeah.
but the Williamson Lectureship was crazy enough that we actually didn't have time to sit down for an interview, so we're doing it now. And we should definitely focus, first and foremost, in this interview on Paolo's new book that will be coming out in the next couple of days. It's called The Water Knife, and do you want to tell everybody sort of a synopsis of the plot and
Sure.
why you wrote
Sure, I
it?
can see the elevator pitch for it, I guess.
Yeah.
The Water Knife is a story about drought and climate change. One of the things I guess I'm always really bad about this, about talking about my books, is I always start talking about the big ideas and then I get down to where, what I actually do with the story. So I
Yeah,
end
but
up
that's
doing
actually
really
cool, because I think the big idea is really relevant here.
I do these wonky sort of like, okay, here's like this, theoretical construct,
Right.
and it's the way I craft my fiction, actually, is that I start with theoretical construct and then I move towards, making visceral characters. So this is a story about drought and climate change in the Southwest, and it focuses on a water war between Phoenix and Las Vegas. The main characters in this story there's three different characters who are sort of point of view people. One of them is Angel Velasquez. He's a water knife for Las Vegas, and water knives are sort of Las Vegas's 007s of water. They go out and they give people offers they can't refuse on their water rights. They blow up other people's water treatment plants. They're the agents who go out and get stuff done for Las Vegas, and they're sort of mythological and universally feared. And then there's character Lucy Monroe, who's a journalist. She's in Phoenix, and she's been in Phoenix for almost a decade, documenting the collapse of Phoenix, as Phoenix has gone through sort of a series of water crises, and as that sort of impacted its economy, and as people have left it, and as it's sort of fallen apart and sort of tried to pull itself back together and then fallen apart again. And she's been there sort of documenting the entire thing and sort of becoming more and more embedded in the world that Phoenix kind of represents. And then the third character is Maria Villarosa, and she's a refugee from Texas. And Texas has also gone through a sequence of disasters, some of them drought-related, some of them hurricane-related, and things like that, and has sent a whole bunch of refugees sort of scattering all
Yeah,
over
you
the map.
basically destroy Texas. Do
I
you
do,
not?
actually.
Yeah.
I take great pleasure.
Yeah.
Not because I don't like Texas, but mostly because I don't like Rick Perry. Um, and so this was, in many ways, this is my fuck you Rick Perry novel.
Right.
But can I say that online?
Yeah, you can.
Um, so Maria has fled Texas and the environmental disasters there, and she's ended up in Phoenix. But she can't get any further. She can't travel any further because as all of these different environmental crises and all of these sort of environmental refugees have started moving around in the country, there's been a big states' rights movement, and so all of the states have started putting up border controls and trying to prevent people from one state from moving into another state. Particularly those states that are still somewhat prosperous are like, no, we can't take you in, we don't want you. And so Maria has made it as far as Phoenix and then been sort of blocked. She can't get up. She can't get north into Utah or Nevada or over into California, and she's sort of stuck trying to fight a way further north to some place where water still falls from the sky. And so the story is really about all of these different viewpoints on water and how it affects people's lives, and so it gives me a chance to sort of think about sort of big picture impacts of climate change, and then how that filters down on a very personal level, sort of details as these different people sort of analyze it or try to cope with it or try to manipulate it for profit, or that's kind of the crux of the book, though.
Right, and sort of to fill in a little bit of the background, you and I are both from the Southwest. You're up
Yeah.
in Colorado, I'm down here in New Mexico, and it's interesting because at the Williamson Lectureship, you focus part of your talk on black swan events, and
Yeah.
drought being a black swan event. And what's interesting about that is I think you and I would be in agreement that it really shouldn't be a black swan event.
Right.
We've already seeing all kinds of precursors that indicate that these things could be coming in, and I think NASA's actually come out and said within the next 30 to 40 years expect a mega-drought to hit.
Right.
But there's a lot of looking past all of the warning signs in our states right now. So, there's this kind of attitude of somehow we're going to find a way. And I think what you're saying is we may have that attitude until we sort of hit a wall and there's no finding a way.
Yeah, we're quite ingenious at short-term solutions until all of them go away.
Right.
And that's the thing that, like some people will say that's a really pessimistic attitude, that, there's this idea that, we're ingenious monkeys and we come up with ingenious solutions, and therefore, we can engineer our way out of a problem, or we can innovate our way out of a problem. And it may be true, but it's an interesting gamble to run. Yeah, and then speaking about just sort of black swans, I think, we understand the idea of drought. It's like, oh yeah, there's a drought, and it goes on for, a year or 2 years or whatever. It's very hard for us to say, well, what happens if, we have a 40-year drought or a 100-year drought? What does that look like?
Right.
And because we don't have some personal historical reference point to say, oh yeah, remember when that happened? It's as if it doesn't exist, but the statistical probability is there, and becoming more so as climate change sort of takes hold, and it's just sort of this really interesting thing where we always assume that we can live out here at the very edges of the limits of what we can achieve without ever thinking that something's going to try to trim us back. It's very, financially speaking, it's very much akin to saying, well, I can totally, max out my credit cards and do all these other things, and buy a giant house and have every toy I want, all the way up until that point when I lose that job that I was counting on. It's like, oh, right, we were living at the edge. We didn't realize we were living at the edge until one critical piece of your prosperity just disappears.
And do you think that we're complacent because we have had some lucky saves due to our ingenuity? I always think of the Green Revolution. I mean, we were heading straight for a wall where we were going to produce more population than we could feed, because of crop yields and what have you. And
I think it's, I sort of do wonder sometimes. So there's a bunch of things, so we sort of said, okay, we're headed towards this point where, too much population, too little food, what happens, and that in itself is, a technology problem of other things, it's like, oh, we figured out penicillin, so not as many people are dying as should be dying. So, you see, we always have these sort of cascades of, when technology solves one problem, creates another problem, and we kind of keep moving along. Some of those are kind of cool. I really appreciate penicillin in modern medicine. So, but with the Green Revolution, I do sort of feel like, okay, wow, there's a bunch of different things. I think that, so yeah, we all managed to feed ourselves. And what that does, though, is it just extends our credit limit. It doesn't solve the problem. And one of the things that I'm interested in science fiction is typically we look towards another technological solution to something that's fundamentally a socio sort of community problem.
Sure.
Like there's a thing where you can say, like, you know what, if we have too many people, we could engineer our society not to have too many. We could, have a one-child per family policy. We could have a different set of policy objectives and a different set of social objectives. We could educate women and therefore, just naturally drive the birth rate down because educated, empowered women have other things to do other than just stay at home and be baby makers for men. There's social things that we can do. There are social technologies that we can apply to solve problems. I think that the Green Revolution essentially bypassed engaging with those and instead let us run out the credit limit further. And what that means is that now when we run up against something, and whether that's, the number of people total on the planet, as we look at another period where it's like, oh, look, as climate change alters the way that, our rainfall and habitat works and stuff like that, that's going to change what we can grow and what can't grow and how reliable crops are and things like that. And again, we're out at the very edges of our capacity. We grow exactly enough food, or maybe not quite enough food for everybody. And so when you have, a drought in Russia and suddenly the wheat prices, go through the roof, you see, how close to the edge we are. Pricing tells us how close to the edge we are. And I think if you go in the grocery store and you look at food prices, you see that we're kind of close to an edge somewhere. So what I think is that, we've managed through technology to sort of, find more food to stuff into the system, but that means we just grew the system to the new capacity level. We didn't actually solve the fundamental issue, which is how do we exist inside of limits? How do we accept limits? How do we celebrate limits? And say, yes, we understand that this is steady state. Outside of this is drawing on our children's well-being. I mean, we're literally taxing our children's well-being. We're going to hand the costs off to them, and And I think that's the thing that's sort of interesting about technology solutions generally is they tend not to engage with actually solving the fundamental problem. They tend to sort of solve the superficial problem.
Well,
right.
So yeah. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say super drought's coming. Not just because of climate change, but if you look in the fossil record of the Sonoran Desert, the northern Sonoran Desert, which is where we live, there were severe droughts that actually drove the Pueblo peoples out of the area for a good long time. And
Phoenix is sitting on top of the bones of another civilization, which was droughted out of existence.
Right.
And if you really want to be like pretend like we aren't really changing the climate at all, it says actually there are these amazing things called basic climactic cycles, which also seem to have profound impacts on cultures which are living right at the edge of their capacity.
Right.
We can tell ourselves that we aren't like the Hohokam or whatever, but it seems like an experiment I'd rather not run, and it seems like one that we're headed straight for. So.
Well, and so you had an interesting story to tell at the Williamson Lectureship about you crashing a certain conference, being the rebel that you are.
Yeah, that was I went to a drought conference in Denver. I was just in Denver for other random reasons, and somebody told me, oh, there's this drought conference happening. I'm like, oh yeah, well, I'll go show up, and I wasn't there's it's in. You were supposed to sign up, and you're supposed to, be on an invited list and stuff like that.
But they didn't have guards.
There is no security for a drought conference because who the fuck would want to crash a drought conference?
Just a crazy writer.
It's the most boring topic in the universe, right? All the way, water. It's so boring until you desperately need
it.
And so I crashed this drought conference, and it was fascinating because you could sit in this room, and this was during Colorado's 2012 drought, and we were seeing all kinds of really interesting impacts of the drought, and so you could hear people talking about the agricultural impacts, which are, that's obvious, it's like, okay, there's going to be ag impacts, but there are also people who are saying that, we have tourism impacts here, because nobody wants to visit a state where all the news is talking about how the forests are on fire.
Right.
And similarly, if the snowpack story isn't good for Colorado, that means tourists go somewhere else to ski. And so there's a tourism impact, which creates other kinds of economic cascades. But then one of the other things was interesting was that there are these things like, oh yeah, when we have forest fires here, that means we also have these epic mudslides.
Yes.
And that also means that, that you have this second round of like terrible news about like your state being the worst disaster zone ever, and nobody wants to visit. So you have things like that. But there were other things that were sort of more hidden sort of dependencies that we also have on water. And one of the ones that was interesting to me was there was a manager of a sewer, water treatment to sewer company who was talking about how they have to manage how much water or how much effluent they can release from their sewage treatment plants depending on the amount of water that's in the river, because they have to have a certain amount of water in the river in order to have the right dilution.
Right.
And otherwise, they're just literally poisoning the river with this effluent. And so even though it's treated, it's still sewage, and you just can't pack too much into a river at any given time. And so that was sort of interesting. So they had to think in terms of like, okay, if there's a drought, how much holding capacity do we have until we can release again? Or, how much can we release at what stages of river flow and stuff, because without that, they don't have anywhere to put their sewage, at least not legally.
That's a pretty disgusting problem.
Right, yeah, exactly. Yeah, so there were things like that were going on, but I think one of the things actually that really stood out to me at that time was that really nobody was really even using the word climate change. And it was as if they were having a conversation about something that was very real and was happening to us and was going to become more and more real over time. And yet nobody could say, like, here, we actually have a general map for what our problems will be in the future, and yet nobody could actually address that. And I remember there was a guy from Denver Water who I sort of cornered after the conference.
Not only did you crash the conference, you assaulted a Denver Water employee.
I only cornered him. And it's really funny because like when he found out that I wasn't at the conference, like later on, you saw him recoil from me, like, oh my god, like you're actually like, who are you, weird member of the public? How did you get into this? But I felt really bad about that actually. But no, I came up to him after the conference was over. And I was like, so like tell me like how long can Denver survive on if it's in a drought like this one, like the 2012 drought, how long can Denver survive these kinds of droughts? And he was like, well, Denver could probably run about like maybe 5 years if we keep having droughts like the 2012 drought. He's like, get really desperate. We'd have to like really look at like whether or not what industrial uses of water were allowed. All the trees in Denver would be dead. Like, there wouldn't be any lawns, of course, long ago, but all the trees as well would be dead by then. But we could sort of squeak out and hang on for 5 years if we kept having 2012 style droughts. And so I asked him, I was like, well, so what are the chances of that happening? And he said, well, it's never happened in the past.
Denver hasn't been around that long in geologic time.
It hasn't, in fact. It's like, okay, so when we're talking about the past, we're talking about since 1920 or so, since we started measuring what. And that's an interesting sort of thing, because it actually fits very closely with the understanding of how we understand that like black swan events ambush us. Mm-hmm. When we think about black swans, the way that human beings build narratives about our lives is, well, yesterday was pretty nice, therefore I think tomorrow would be pretty nice. I sort of build my anticipation of tomorrow based on the past, mm-hmm. my past experience. And so here's this guy saying the same exact thing. He says, well, our past experience says this doesn't exist as an issue. And then you sort of have to say, well, given that climate change is happening, what are the chances? That's the only real question we can do. The past is no longer our model. I mean, can we agree on this? And he kind of looks at me and he's like, well, that math is really hard to do. That's a pretty difficult problem to actually solve. It's got a lot of unknowns, and it's sort of impossible math essentially. And that was really striking to me, because it's like, these are the people who are the experts at delivering the core basic needs of a city, and to them, figuring out how much danger they're in is too hard a problem. Like, that doesn't bode well to me. It's like, if the experts just say, well, golly, this is just difficult, this is hard, math is hard, well, you start thinking like, wow, nobody's looking out for us at all then. Our confidence in our survival capacity should be actually significantly lower then. Is that right? Like, so yeah. A city doesn't exist if it doesn't have water. A house doesn't exist if it doesn't have water. Yeah. Like,
people are water to a very large extent. We have a lot of water in our systems.
Yeah. And it's like this hidden, it's this hidden necessity. And you sort of say, okay, so what would happen if you turned off the spigot on an entire city? And that's exactly what I did with Phoenix. Is there's a moment in the Water Knife where the Central Arizona project gets bombed, and it's actually disrupted all of Phoenix's water supplies. And it's like, well, what is the value of a space where you can't turn on the water anymore? And actually, like, some of that was kind of like sort of started me thinking about like what does an emptied city look like, and how does it function? It's like, oh, the houses are theoretically there, and yet the reason that allowed people to flourish inside of them goes away. Right. And that's sort of fascinating stuff to me. So that's sort of the long-winded sort of backstory on Water Knife, I guess.
Well, but it goes along with the tradition in science fiction of being the genre of the possible, and being the genre that holds up Medusa's mirror, to borrow an analogy from Ray Bradbury, which was that what science fiction was about was showing people themselves without being obvious about showing people themselves. Right. Sort of having it's about aliens, or it's about this, that, or the other. Or even to a certain extent, in the film entertainment, it's go ahead and laugh at the green blood and, all this kind of stuff. Right. And that actually serves as a fairly effective distraction while people are listening or watching a story about something that's very relevant to today. And is that why you define yourself as a science fiction author, or what particularly draws you to this genre?
It's the tools. The tools of science fiction specifically. It's interesting. Like lately, there's a bunch of stuff there. It's science fiction asks certain questions that I think are interesting, and they are inherently science fictional questions. It's, if this goes on, what will the world look like? Not what's here today, but what's out there. what's tomorrow? What's 10 years from now? What's 100 years from now? What's this trend? If I build this trend out, what does it look like? And when you use that tool, like, you get to look out at some weird, distorted future. I've likened it to sort of having funhouse glasses on. That you give your reader these strange funhouse glasses. They look at this weird, distorted future. But what happens is when they close the book, they'll come back into their present moment, and suddenly they see everything in a different light. They've incorporated some of that distortion into their own world, and it contextualizes their world. And so it means that when they read about Lake Mead being at lowest record levels, they can suddenly say, oh, I read about something like that in the Water Knife. That was a disaster.
Right.
And you're like, yes, that was a disaster.
Right.
And suddenly something that seems fairly esoteric, which is, I mean, you look at like the photographs of a low Lake Powell or a low Lake Mead, they're actually quite beautiful. You've got the sky, you've got the water,
you've got the beautiful bathtub ring around.
The bathtub ring. It's actually quite picturesque.
It is.
It's like, this does not look like disaster, but it is a disaster. And I think that, like, if you do your fiction right, suddenly your present moment has a huge amount of context because you've seen extrapolations of what the implications of these very sort of serene photos are actually telling us. And so that's a lot of, like, what I think about, like, why I like science fiction is that it feels like that's the tool for creating genuine context for a present moment. You just don't. There's no other genre, and there's no other really literature that seems interested in particularly deeply contextualizing sort of the esoterica of our present moment that are also, the vital pieces of information that we need to know about.
Well, so let's talk a little bit about how you got into writing science fiction. So I'm going to share the story of how I met Paolo. I met Paolo after you were multi-published, been nominated for a few awards, that
short
kind
stories,
of a thing, for short stories. And it was at Mile High Con, which is in Denver, and Daniel Abraham recognized his name and brought him along to lunch. And Mile High Con is where...
That was my first convention ever. That was my first science
Yeah,
fiction
exactly.
thing.
It was his first convention ever. So Daniel and I and Carrie Vaughn and several other Southwestern authors had been going to Mile High Con for years. We all knew each other pretty well, and here comes this newcomer who's more publications and more awards and whatever than any of the rest of us, going, oh, I've never met other writers before. Here we were on our side thinking all the help we've given each other, trying to critique each other and help each other along and be there when, one of us is melting down thinking, I just can't do this anymore. And here's this guy who hasn't had any of that coming on in on the scene. But lest people think you actually did have an easy ride, why don't you tell the story from your side?
It was funny because I was so excited. I was like, look, writers! Oh, wow, I'm so excited to meet you guys. Like, where do you guys live? Like, I mean, you guys had a community that you were working inside of, and I came up writing completely outside of the science fiction community, and essentially in isolation from all writing communities. I had this idea back in my 20s that I wanted to be a writer, and it got to be an obsession for me, and I started writing. And when I was in my 20s, of course, I sat down. I remember when I was starting to work on my first book and really getting serious about it. I was like, I'm going to write this book. It's going to be amazing. I'm going to be published by the time I'm 25. I'm going to be, a rock star. And it totally didn't work out that way, of course. I wrote I think I'd written for about maybe 10 years before I even met you guys, I think. Mm-hmm. And I'd written 4 novels that I'd failed to sell. Each time I'd write a novel, it would get sent out to publishers and stuff, and then it would get rejected, and then I would stew about it and try to figure out what I did wrong, and then I would try to write a new novel. And then I did that again, and I did that again, and finally became actually completely demoralized with the difficulty of writing novels, and the amount of effort and your heart and soul that you had to pour into a book, and then watch it be just trashed, was just too horrible. And I just couldn't see putting a year and a half of my life into something that then would just be rejected within, weeks, and
Right.
then you're like, wow, back to square one again. That was
Right.
that was a waste of a year and a half. But somewhere along that period of 10 years of writing, I did sort of figure out that like I'm a happier and more sort of grounded and centered person when I am writing, and that something about the act of writing is either meditative or at least stabilizing for me. And so when I gave up on writing books, I sort of looked around at everything that I'd tried, and at one point I had written a short story that had sold, and I had that editor, Gordon Van Gelder at FNSF, get back to me and say, hey, have you written anything else? This was a couple of years after I'd written.
Which doesn't typically happen, I'm just saying. This
Right,
is the kind of thing that happens if you're Paolo Bacigalupi.
Right, because all is shiny in shiny land, right?
Yeah.
Well, it was an interesting thing because at the time when he was coming back and saying, hey, have you written anything else? I was really focused on books, and I was like, no, I'm really trying to write these books, and and it didn't penetrate to me that there was this little wedge of a door that was open for me. And so when I was sort of reevaluating my whole life and sort of giving up on the idea of being a novelist, it was like, well, maybe I'll write short stories. I mean, there is that, Gordon, and this was finally that moment. I was like, Gordon asked me if I had any other short stories. It's like, maybe he wasn't kidding. Maybe he really wanted me to write more stuff.
Maybe he doesn't typically go harassing writers for more short stories, because have you seen the size of the man's slush pile?
Right, exactly. And so that was the sort of the turning point for me, actually, was that I started writing short stories, and I was pretty content with the idea that I was going to be doing it as a hobby. It was going to be a sideline thing while I, kept my day job, and, that was just the way it was going to be. Almost immediately after I started writing short stories, like, good things started to happen.
Yeah, putting it mildly.
Yeah, no, it was really, I mean, it was a weird thing because, like, I'd come to this point of total despair where I was like, fuck it, I clearly have no career as a writer.
Right.
Oh well, I guess I'll write anyway, but let's just, like, this career shit's done.
Right.
And the first short story that I wrote was The Fluted Girl. And then after that, I wrote The People of Sand and Slag. And I think after that came The Calorie Man. And each one of those, sort of rolled out and, had a sort of a bigger and bigger impact. They were nominated for awards. They were, republished in year's best anthologies. And it was this huge, it was like this 0 to 60 kind of moment where, you'd sort of been nobody, and then suddenly you, for some reason, were doing it right finally. And I don't know whether that was because I finally loosened up, but certainly it was because I'd spent 10 years learning craft and being rejected. But yeah, everything changed then, and it was really a rapid, strange shift to sort of go from like nobody caring about what you did to people really being excited about it, and it was really gratifying in a lot of ways. It was really a huge relief to feel like you weren't insane. And so then around that time was when I came and met you guys, and actually fairly soon after that was actually when I started genuinely starting to think about going back and trying to write novels again, and it was largely because I met you guys. I remember hanging out, it was specifically at That Mile High Con, and it was meeting you and Daniel and Carrie, and it was going to see Daniel do his reading and talk about his Shadow and Summer books were going to come out. The Long Price Quartet books were going to come out, and just starting to. So he had his cover designs and stuff, which were amazing. And so he's like, "Here's the cover design for the book," and you're like, "Wow, this is like a guy, like a person. He's like a real physical person." And it's like, "Oh, that's what an author looks like. He's a person. Look at that. Like, this is not a mythological object. This is a people. Like, I can see the people, and, I can see that the people does work, and if the people does work, then the people apparently gets book deals." So, you sort of look at that, and Carrie, I think, had her first book was out for the kiddie books, and her second book was just getting ready for press, and I remember watching them and being like, oh, that's what an author looks like. That's what you do. You keep following these steps. And it's like, well, like, if I'm smart, then I'm going to just get behind them and walk in those steps. What did they do? Well, if I want to be a novelist, I really have to, like, write another novel.
Well, and it's interesting that you met us as a group, because Daniel and Carrie, quite a few of us started in short stories, which is not the only way into a writing career, but it is a way. And it's a way that is available in science fiction and fantasy. Not a whole lot of genres have the healthy short fiction markets with the awards and all of the things that science fiction and fantasy have. And so Daniel Abraham and Carrie Vaughn are two very good examples of people who started that way. They started small, short stories, and they've built up to very successful New York Times bestselling novel careers. And so meeting them, having already started to succeed at the short story writing, that seems very serendipitous.
Right. Well, and it was like, oh, I actually see a model, and this mirrored something that, like, years ago I'd stalked William Gibson at a signing and sort of peppered him with questions. And one of the things that he'd said was, you know, about how he got his career going was that he had written enough short stories that people finally took him seriously enough that they were willing to risk money on a novel for him. And yeah, and I think that, like, I mean, this is something that's really interesting to me specifically about science fiction, is that the community is so strong and so passionate, and that it likes to find new authors and nurture them, and that it gets excited about them and sort of builds them up. And so, you know, many of the authors I know actually, you know, were people who started in short stories, wrote short stories, established their craft in short stories, established something of their name and sort of legitimacy in short stories, and then started moving into novels. And for me, without question, my short stories were the only way I was ever going to get my novels sold. I think, you know, even with Windup Girl, when I finally wrote it, it was still rejected by every single major New York house. But I knew Nightshade Books because I'd been going to conventions and because I'd been writing the short stories, and they were fans of my short fiction and stuff. And so, you know, A, that there were small presses like that who were excited about your work, but B, like, that, you know, that you had establishing credentials essentially in short fiction that then opened doors that wouldn't have otherwise been there in some other genre at all. I just feel like it's interesting how I feel like a lot of people these days say, well, oh, that's silly to write short stories, just go write the novels. And it's true, you can try to, like, you know, just storm the gates. And certainly I do know people who've succeeded.
Oh yeah, there's plenty of people who have done that. But
you know, if you want to be a novelist, by God, go be a novelist, right? Sure. But in a career sense, it feels like there's some things that you kind of get out of, like, that build that I think really benefit. And part of it's the community, part of it's the camaraderie, part of it's the slow building of a fan base before you actually even have a book out. And so, like, there's a sort of a jump start there that's not, instead of you just being like, here's my book, you know, who am I? But, like, there's a bunch of people who are already sort of buzzing about you. And so then when your book comes out, like, they're like, oh, I've been waiting for him to write something in, you know, long form. Oh, that's interesting, you know. That there's sort of a jump start sort of market and support system for novelists in science fiction and fantasy that it just doesn't quite feel like that's there in any other space. I mean, certainly, like, when I'm working in YA and stuff like that, the YA community is diffuse and, you know, not highly interconnected, really. You know, people are connected by serendipity. They aren't connected by these, you know, amazing conventions that fans put on and that actually encourage authors all to be in one spot and interact with one another and build networks of connections and, you know, professional understandings and things like that really go a long way.
Well, the nice thing about short stories is that, you know, in an ideal world, you manage to corner an editor and you have an amazing conversation and they are so incredibly sold on your skills and your personality and what have you that they then buy your novel. That doesn't happen very often. Okay, it does probably happen now and then, but not often. But short stories... It only
happens to me.
Well, short stories... well, another way to do it, and the way quite a few people have done it, is they keep submitting novels, and the editors get to know who this person is, and okay, just send your next one, and that can work, but it also takes a lot of time. Short stories, to me, seem like a good sort of halfway point, provided you have the skills to be able to write them, because they don't take as long, and you're able to have that dialogue a little bit faster. A lot of editors do read the short story markets, and so they get to know you over that period of time, looking at sort of a portfolio of your work, so that by the time you then come to them with a novel, as was the case with you and Nightshade, I gather, they know who you are, and you've kind of had that conversation of, okay, yes, I understand, you know, yes, you know how to craft a story, yes, I have some faith in your ability here.
Yeah, no, and I mean, and those short stories really did open up conversations with editors, and in many cases, you know, it's just, you know, they still found Windup Girl an incredibly tough sell in the end.
Yeah.
But it was interesting that, like, you know, that I could sit down with Jim Minns or somebody at a Worldcon, and that he was willing to give me an hour of his time at lunch
Right.
You know, where we could talk about, you know, hey, I'm thinking about writing this book. Are you interested in that? You know, does this even sound remotely interesting to you? You know, that you could have that conversation and seem legitimate because, you know, of your short story accomplishments that opened up doors, and sort of like just made it feel like there were relationships that, you know, they weren't, there were no guarantees. I mean, obviously I had a lot of rejections regardless of the number of award nominations I had, but you did have a lot of friendly relationships to sort of say, hey, yeah, let's have a conversation here. There's at least a door open for a conversation. You know, that's not necessarily a book deal, but it is a conversational starting point. And that was really different for me also, you know, from my first books where I was just submitting anonymously as
you're nobody.
Agent.
Right.
And they don't know me. I don't know who the fuck they are.
Right.
Like, you know, hopefully they like whatever it is, you know, that's mysteriously, you know, in the soup that editors like for books, but you don't know what it is. And, you know, like it was just sort of a, and so like, yeah, when I was working on Windup Girl and especially when I was working on Shipbreaker and things like that, some of those conversations and relationships also sort of had clarified a lot of my understanding too about what you were trying to write. You start to understand like what's the problem that you're solving for an editor when you give them a book, as opposed to like, I just poured my heart and soul out of this book, here, take it.
Right.
It's like, well, the editor is sitting here going like, I don't think I can even move 5,000 units of this, so no, like the editor doesn't know how to move that many units. Like you're kind of dead in the water right away, and you know, let alone any larger number. And you know, so there were some things like that too, being like just involved in the science fiction writing and editing and publishing community, like sort of started to give you more insight into, oh, this is the beast that I'm within. And I don't know. Yeah, I mean, it's like I can't count the number of benefits that have come from going to conventions and from meeting other writers and from the, you know, the friendly advice, the support, you know, I remember having a writer who I barely met, you know, take me aside and say, you know, watch out for that editor. You know, he's, you know, totally a shark and he will totally fuck you over. And I was like, wow, thanks. Because that editor was actually completely, you know, sort of like skeezing around and sort of asking about things. And like, and it's great to have that warning. Thank you. Like, you know, and like, you know, and if you, you know, so there was, you know, that kind of stuff would happen. But I mean, other things like, I ended up going to Blue Heaven because I went to the World Fantasy Convention. I met Charles Coleman Finley, and that turned out to be this amazing experience where I got to meet a whole bunch of other writers who gave me fantastic critiques on Windup Girl. And it also gave me a whole bunch of other people who also were sort of walking through the steps of becoming novelists, and that you could follow inside of their steps. And so it was particularly powerful to sort of see a writer would bring a book to a workshop like Blue Heaven, and you'd see it and you're like, oh my god, this book is shit. It's so fucked. It's broken in 10,000 different ways. And the critiques would be brutal. You know, it's like, yes, it's fucked here, it's fucked here, it's fucked here, it's fucked here. And you sort of like look at it with pity and you're like, oh, that poor fucker, he's dead. Like, it's never going to happen. And then like 6 months later, you hear from the person, they're like, I sold my book. And you're like, shit, I guess they really did the rewrites. I'll be damned.
Well,
and then the lesson to you is immediately, oh, I should do the rewrites.
Yes.
Like I was actually looking at those Windup Girl rewrites over there and dreading them. And like, if you want to follow and become published too, like you have to turn your shitty book into something better. And that's, you know, I think that like having those role models who are not way out ahead of you. I mean, William Gibson is great as an iconic sort of person. J.G. Ballard, whoever those people are, Ursula Le Guin, you know, it's like, ah, but they're so distant. They're like sort of magical gods. They aren't real. So having role models that are like only like one step ahead of you, where you're like, oh, that's how so-and-so got that far. That's great. Like I'm going to keep keeping an eye on these people who are just a little ahead of me in the career path, because those are the ones who have just solved the next problem that I'm trying to solve. Like I need to learn from them, and that's I think a lot of my career actually is dependent on being able to look around and sort of see, okay, what do I need to learn from somebody? What can their decisions tell me? You know, watching Daniel have an entire career tank, you know, was like, holy cow! Like that's look at this. Like, you know, Daniel is like, I mean, he is kind of a god to me, actually, but. Don't tell him I said that, but
it's on the internet now.
It's recorded shit. No, but I mean, seriously, he's like so explicitly. Someone like Daniel Abraham, he has the Long Price Quartet come out,
just gorgeous,
fanfare,
beautiful writing,
beautiful covers, beautiful writing, really smart stuff. The series tanks. Like,
well,
you know, within like 2 books or something like that, he's like, this series is in a death
well,
spiral.
and it had a blurb.
It's done.
It had a quote from George R. R. Martin. He's George R. R.
Right,
Martin's
right.
protege and all of these things. But
it's the title from Tor. It's like, it's going out.
But they ordered 12,000 hardcovers. And hardcovers, you want to try to get a 60% sell-through.
Right.
And that's really hard.
It's gonna be sad.
Yeah, and
right.
So yeah.
And so what you see though, like what I really learned from that though, is watching this thing. He's like this, you know, he comes out with fanfare, watches the series go into a death spiral, and he's like, "Huh, well that's not great." And
move on.
One author's solution to that would be like, "Oh no, like woe is me, life is shit," you know. And Daniel's response is, "Well, I'm going to start up a pseudonym. I'm going to become Emmeline Hanover. I'm going to write urban fantasy. I'm going to pitch another series of epic fantasy stuff, doing something completely different with epic fantasy under my own name. I'm going to start working with Ty Frank, and we're going to do this James S.A. Corey thing." And he's like, "Huh, I lost on my first bet. What do? I'm going to triple down. That's what I'm going to do."
Right.
And his comment has always been, you know, we're gamblers, so, you know, keep placing bets on the table. That's what writers are. We place more creative bets. You don't know what's going to pay off, but you can place more bets. That's what you can control.
And so Windup Girl...
And it pays off. Like, I mean, ultimately, like, you know, you don't know what will work, but, like, you know you can place more bets. And it's not about woe is me. It's about, like, what do I control?
And it's also about being the last man standing, I think. I mean, I think a lot of people drop out, and that... To a certain extent, the people who make it are the survivors. And I don't mean to be completely, you know, dismissive of people like you or such, but I'm actually probably more talking about people like me. You know what I mean? I stayed in the game, and that is very much a part of how it is that you...
Yeah, no, the way you win is you actually keep playing.
You keep playing.
Yeah, no, I think there is something about stamina that's really, really interesting. Because, you know, I can look at, like, and it's like, I think... When I've looked at it before, I've thought about it as being writers who have this certain capacity to try something, to fail at it, to learn from what they failed at, to try something different, to try again, to learn from that failure when it fails, to try again. And they can go through this try, fail, learn, try, fail, learn. And the people who have the stamina to keep cycling through that, those are the people who tend to break out. They're, you know, if people get locked in a try-fail where they never learn, you know, then you can have basically it's pointless stamina. But if you can work through a cycle of trying, failing, and learning from failures to try something new, those people, and with stamina, continuing onwards, those people tend to break out. And it's something like when I look back at my own career, it's like, oh, look at that. Literally every single novel that I wrote when I was failing was slightly different. I was learning new skills. I was trying a different attack on what storytelling was, and then, you know, even, you know, when I switched over to short stories, and when I came back to novels again, and, you know, each stage, you know, you're still doing that, and yeah, I mean, like, I know other people who were in college with me who also wanted to be writers. I know lots of people who, you know, over the years, we've known people who've had one breakout story or had a breakout book or whatever, and then disappear, and it's like the stamina to keep going is, I mean, it's an incredible thing. It's surprising that people have stamina for it because it's hard.
Yeah, like running headfirst into a wall over and over and over again until you break through is kind of what it feels like sometimes. But in my career, I started making a living by self-publishing, and that's one thing I've definitely seen over there as well. There's a lot of people who start up and try, and my sales might even have been worse than theirs starting out, but they get discouraged and they drop out. And so 5 years later, they wonder how it is you're staying afloat. Well, I didn't quit, and you just keep going.
No.
But
I showed up once again. I showed up. No, I was just talking to another writer. Same thing. He's like, I know writers who are better writers than I am.
Yeah.
They're better skilled. They like better, more beautiful prose. They were more talented in my Clarion workshop. Like they were all like, you know, better than me. He's like, they're all dead.
Yeah.
Like, I'm still standing. And it's like, why? Because I am relentless.
Right.
And it's like, yeah, this is, I mean, you know, it's a core skill. It's a core necessary part of your identity that you have to have as a sort of relentless tenacity. And
well, so let's talk about Windup Girl, because that's actually a pretty awesome Cinderella story of a novel.
Okay.
And we've kind of laid a lot of the groundwork for it, because Windup Girl would not have sold at all, do you think, if you didn't have the network that you had in science fiction?
I think that's true. Yeah. No, I think absolutely. I mean, there were so many people So this is actually sort of interesting to me right now, especially because we're talking like there's a whole bunch of stuff that's been happening with the Hugos and everything,
Yeah.
and there's much ferment in fandom at the moment,
and I've been like not talking about it at all, basically. Like I'm just,
right,
yeah.
Well, and so like one of the things that like I mean I look back at my whole career and I'm so grateful for all of the people who have reached out at different times and been like, hey, I want to help you. Hey, let me give you some advice. Hey, let me point you in this direction. Fundamentally, you have to do the work.
Yeah.
You still have to write something that people can be excited about. You still have to focus and be serious about your work. But I think that there's a huge premium value on trying to be nice to people and trying to be a decent, copacetic human being with people.
Which is a challenge for some writers.
It's a challenge for all of us. Like, we're all going to run into some asshole someday, right? Or we're all going to run into that moment when we want to be that asshole because it's so viscerally satisfying to be able to punch somebody down, right? But it's not a great strategy for a career.
Yeah, it's not.
And what I've noticed is that, like, if you work more on the side of, like, trying to be kind, helpful, and engaged with people, that not only is that I just sort of generally think that's a better kind of person, being a better kind of person, but it's interesting how many people also want to see you succeed on some level too.
Right.
And I've noticed that with other people that I've met along the years now as I've moved further in my career. There are certain people where I'm like, that person, wow, they are really sweet. I want to help them somehow. I want to do something for them. I want to go some extra mile. I will connect them with somebody. I will recommend them somewhere. And it's like, yeah, they've got the talent, but it's like, I don't want to help a talented asshole.
Right.
Like, I have no interest. Like, I don't give a fuck about your talent.
Right.
Like, at that point, like, I want your talent, and I want to feel like it's legitimate for me to say, yeah, I'm helping this person out. Like, because I value quality.
Right.
But if you're an asshole, that's not going to happen. Like, I don't open doors for you if you're an asshole.
Right.
And so, anyway, going back, though, then to the Windup Girl, the short stories, without question, opened up doors and started to establish a level of legitimacy for me. And then there was this interesting moment, though. I mean, like, the Windup Girl story was really kind of interesting because, like, I finally did kind of get my ego back in the game. I was like, all right, I'm going to try to write another novel. Here we go. Oh, God. And, it's a book that I thought was going to take 1 year. It ended up taking me 3 years to write it. It was a huge mess. I had to do huge revisions on it. And then when I took it out to publishers, like even publishers who liked me and, had said, yes, I definitely want to see your book and all this kind of stuff, universally they rejected it across the board. All the major publishers.
Well, because it's a business decision, and a lot of people hit that wall where.
Right, they can like you, but they still won't sink themselves.
And the big publishers have high overhead costs. So and that's literally what they're saying.
If they think we can sell 500 copies of this book, it's not the kind of project that they're going to be interested in
because it doesn't cover their costs, and that's really all it comes down to. And I know people get really wrapped up in that, but quite often it's literally that's all they're saying is
your book is having a conversation with a manufacturing machine. That's not personal. That's like we're trying to understand how many units we can move, whether we can cover our costs, whether or not we can come back at the end of the day smiling, or whether we're like, oh wow, we were suckers, we shouldn't have bought that book and we just lost our shirts on it.
And people have to get laid off and not fun stuff like that.
And The Windup Girl was a hard book. I mean, it had a lot of points of view. It was science fiction, and the general understanding about science fiction is that it doesn't sell. There's a lot of things about it that were really, made it a harder sell right from the start. They're like, well, we know that science fiction sells a quarter of what fantasy sells.
Right.
And, there's those certain metrics that people use to understand what's being pitched to them. But one of the things that was interesting was that the book was actually going out right during the 2008 economic collapse, and there had been an editor, Juliet Ullman at Bantam, had been interested in the book, but hadn't been able to get anybody else on board with it at Bantam, and then soon after she was fired. So we joked for a while that actually Windup Girl was what got her fired. But then Bantam kind of went away entirely.
Right.
Spectra, I mean. So the thing was, though, is that Juliet then calls up Nightshade, and she calls up Jason and Jeremy, and we all know each other because we've all been drinking at different places, fantasies and things like that.
Right.
And she calls them up, and she's like, Paolo's got this novel. You should totally make an offer. Call his agent, and then she's like, and hire me to be the editor on it.
Uh-huh.
And they did. And it was like this kind of cool thing where it's like a whole bunch of people kind of are like, we like this stuff. I like this stuff. Let's all put together like a scheme where we can make this thing happen anyway.
And they're smaller, and they can afford a smaller print run, and
right. And they've got less overhead. You know, it's a couple of guys living in a house in San Francisco instead of a major New York publishing house. You know, like and Nightshade was like, we were hoping for break even on this book. I mean, they had no illusions about like the book becoming successful or anything. They're like, we hope we don't lose our shirts. That's what we're gunning for here. But they'd done a nice job with my short story collection, and it was like, and these were guys who actually wanted to publish short stories. Nobody wants to publish short stories, right? I mean,
yeah, because they're not economically a good idea,
right? That's an insane prospect entirely. But they were fans, and so they loved the work, and. And so, then there was this, thing where, like, so they all kind of put together this scheme to do this thing, and we did it, and the book came out, and we had no idea what was going to happen.
It's a really great story.
Yeah, and so, like, I remember, there was a moment when I was calling them, because I noticed that the book had sold out on Amazon, and I was like, did we sell out of the copies? And they're like, no, we did not sell out. What's happening right now is that everything is sent out. We're waiting for all the returns that are about to come back. Then we'll send out all the returns to the other bookstores.
Right, because Amazon only keeps 3 to 5 copies.
Right, and so, like, this is not, they're like, if you sell out of your print run in the next year, we'll be happy. Like, you go not sell out of your print run in the first month, so just shut up and go back to bed. And then, like, 2 weeks after that, they called me up, and they were like, well, it seems weird, but we think actually we did sell out of the print run, so we're going to go back and print some more copies.
In the first month?
Yeah, it was like 2 months after.
Okay.
Within 2 months of the book coming out, like, they were going back for a second printing. And then like, almost a week after that, they're like, we're going back for another printing. And then it was like another week after that, we're going back for another printing. It was like, bang, bang, bang. And suddenly the book was just selling. And it was like, whoa, what's happening? And then, right in December, Time Magazine named it as one of the top 10 novels of the year. And
which is not bad.
It was kind of crazy. It was hard to kind of put your head around.
Right.
And then it went on, and it won all these awards. It won the Hugo and the Nebula and the John W. Campbell and the Locus Award, and then finally it won the Hugo. And it was like, you saw this entire chain happen, and it was just like the freight train got going, and then it got going faster and faster, and every time you thought it was about to slow down, it actually would just speed up. And it was pretty incredible, and it was and a shock to go from like sort of feeling like, wow, the stuff I write is completely unsellable and unbuyable, to, oh my god, it's this best-selling book.
It's in Time Magazine,
winning all these awards, and and it has this huge amount of respect, and mostly you just end up feeling really grateful.
Yeah. But I think it's a great story because of all the moving parts to it. How you began with the networking and all of these things. And that book, in a way, was the making of Nightshade as the publisher that it was for the time that it existed.
Yeah. No, for sure.
So, when I asked you in sort of the pre-interview questions that you aren't working on anything right now, do you want to talk about not working about anything right now? Because you mentioned that it involved you being in a weird space, which, as I've said, has been you for as long as I've known you. But what different weird space are you in now?
I'm a little exhausted right now. Well, actually, so one of the things that I, in this, like, I think it's important for writers to be thinking about business and about thinking about their careers and thinking about survival, thinking about making sure they actually can pay the bills. So one of the things that I did when I was working on Windup Girl was I also started working on YA books, and so I wrote Shipbreaker and actually like launched 2 careers almost simultaneously. Windup Girl came out and then Shipbreaker came out, and both of them did really, really well, and so I essentially started up 2 careers at once, which is really cool, except for then you have to work really, really hard to try to keep 2 careers going.
It's what Carrie Vaughn calls the problems you dream of having.
Right, yeah, exactly. Except for the reality is all you can do is disappoint a lot of people because you cannot work that fast and that hard unless you're Daniel Abraham.
Or Carrie. Carrie does it pretty well too.
Right. So the thing was though is I basically ended up doing especially over this last couple of years, I ended up letting my adult stuff kind of go fallow for a lot of reasons, but kept my YA work going and was really enjoying that. But eventually, I wanted to get my adult work started again, and so I needed to essentially write 2 books simultaneously, maintaining my sort of publishing schedule in YA while I also restarted my adult work. I kind of hit a break point by doing that, where I managed to do everything that I'd set out to do. I remember mapping out my year and what I was supposed to accomplish during that year, and by the end of the year, I'd done it all, but it really kind of broke me, and it really, really burned me out. And so one of the things I'm sort of thinking about a lot right now is like how this has to do with stamina and how do you build a long-term career? And what I've noticed is that we do burn out. We do, either get destroyed by disappointment, but we can also be mangled by success. And so I've been thinking a lot about like how authors care for ourselves, how we make sure that we're actually living good, healthy, stable lives, that we have good physical and mental health, things like that. And so I've actually been in something of a hiatus for about the last 6 months, where once I nailed down all the work that I needed to do, there's basically a period. I've got another right now, like just a little more time before I start going out on tour for Waterknife, and I was like, I think I need to slow down and actually recenter and reset a lot of things. And one of those things actually is to stop writing right now and actually like sort of let the hole in my brain heal, where I burned it out from like working it a little too hard.
Well, and creative exhaustion is a very real thing, and the problem is it doesn't manifest like other types of exhaustion. And so sometimes it's easy to beat up on yourself and think that you're lazy, when you really, if you think of everything you've been asking yourself to do, it's okay that you feel like playing video games for 3 days straight, or, or just going to watch movies, or just recharging. And I think writers overextend themselves on accident quite often.
Yeah, and some of that, you see, and so, I feel really lucky that, like, I'm in a position right now financially, thank you, war chest that I built up, was that, like, I can say, I'm going to slow down now, I'm going to spend some of the war chest on me becoming healthier, because I think that you can get caught, especially and this is the thing about the genre fiction stuff that I think is hard sometimes, is like there's that expectation that you've got to publish, a book a year, or more, depending on how much money you're making. Because if you're making it the very low end of the mid list, like you've got to really be publishing like crazy in order to keep going, and that's not. It doesn't feel creatively sustainable. It feels like sort of like the pressure to sort of jump yourself right off a creative cliff, and
you have to employ a lot of tricks to do it.
Yeah.
And one thing is, I think writing
my trick is to have a wife that was also able to support me during certain periods of my life. So,
right.
That's like.
But as you know, some writers make a career of basically writing the same book over and over again, and I don't mean to be sort of dismissive at all. And writing fast.
Here's a set of solves. Okay.
Yeah, and writing fast often materializes as that, and you almost it's like artists who create series of paintings that are very similar to each other. Writers that and you're not that kind of writer at all. Your books don't fall into these series or these likenesses.
It's a different, and that's, I think that's the difference of there's some different stylistic things, there's some different like process things that I do in terms of like how I boil books down and how I develop them, and a lot of them have to do with the revision processes that I have, which are really, really long and really sort of complicated. Like if I was stuck in that space where it was like, oh my God, I have to write a book every 3 months or something like that, there's instantaneously some things that you change. You say, okay, it's going to be a first-person point of view.
Right.
It's going to be like, there's things that like solve many creative questions immediately. Oh, well, what's your narrative voice going to be? Well, it's the same as the character's voice. That's how that's solved. Okay, moving on. Like, so, you talk about it as like sort of like variable reduction. Like, how many writing variables can I reduce so that I can, move through the solving just the core issues of plot. There are some, I can see exactly how you would sort of go about doing that if you're like
because otherwise
in the speed sort of thing. I don't think it's not optimal for coming up with super. It's not optimal for making your ideas breathe as much as they could.
Yeah,
I think that's
for a writer like you, it definitely.
I think that for me, there's a lot of the that I run into spots where, like written something that's okay. And I feel like it's not my superpower is not actually being a good writer. I feel like my superpower is being a good rewriter.
Every writer says that.
And if I can identify, like, so I'll write something. It's like if I have to go with the first draft, that's gonna be fine. If I can sit there and look at it and realize, oh, you know what? There's actually only one cool piece in this whole story. Let's throw away 50,000 words and start it over with this cool piece as the center. Then I end up with something that I think is really actually very, very interesting and very impressive, but it takes a lot more work. And it involves sort of like accepting that a lot of what you've done already is trash and doesn't actually belong anywhere in the draft. It's not just like, oh, I should just, edit down the sentences some and make them tighter. It's, oh, I should throw it all away and start again because I finally figured out that the fluted girls are the only interesting thing in the story, and Madame Bovary is not, in fact, viewpoint character here.
Well,
whatever. It's like those kinds of things.
And your books, I mean, the Windup Girl kind of says everything that you had to say about the Windup Girl and told the story. There's not really room for like Windup Girl the sequel or things like that if I'm reading you right. And in order to get that high concentration of creativity and innovation and everything into a book, you absolutely need to take that time, take care of yourself. You can't be writing a book every 3 months.
Or at least I can't be. It's one of those things where, like, what you do see is you see different people, different writers have different superpowers, and there are definitely times where I've watched Daniel work, and it's like the discipline that he brings to his work. I'm like, why can't I be more like Daniel? And I can beat myself up all I want about why I can't be more like Daniel, but the reality is I seem to be this package, and I have certain superpowers, and you're trying to find a way to build a career that works around my superpowers and my limitations.
Right.
I think that's sort of like you have to sort of have a lot of you have to be gentle with yourself and sort of accept where you're at too and what you are. So. Well,
and see, there's a lot of ways to skin the proverbial cat, and it's just a matter of finding yours. And the nice thing about networking with other people is you do see, even if you don't know other authors who are like you, you see the diversity of how people get to that goal.
No, and I think you can learn from all of them. I mean, I think that the sort of the thing that I value the most, I mean, it's really interesting. Like, again, like, going back to the Hugo's thing, there's all this conversation about the difference between, like, hack work versus literary fiction, with quote unquote, around those words, oh, these are entertainments, and oh, this is literary, and this is, trash, and that's, gold, or whatever the fuck those labels are. And I feel like it's all really arbitrary labeling. I mean, like, I just sort of like, I think about every single writer that I've learned from, and some of those are some of the trashiest books, trashiest, quote unquote, out there. It's like, I can pick up 50 Shades of Grey, and I can learn stuff from that.
Yes.
It's not about, like, sort of saying, like, oh, this is good and this is bad. It's like, what's powerful here? What works? What do I need to learn? I can pick up, what is it, the Da Vinci Code, and there's things in there that I'm like, this is trashy.
Right,
but what does he do? Look at this. Look at how he does pacing. Look at this. This is masterful. And you're supposed to learn those things. And I think that, like, we shut ourselves off as writers when we start, like, sort of labeling different styles and different storytellers as being, like, all garbage or all genius or whatever. You sort of, like, look and you pick and choose and you learn. You're just supposed to be learning from everybody.
In an industry where 5% of the workers in writing make half the money, it always kind of cracks...
It's like a 1% thing. It's like a banker.
Well, it always cracked me up how, like, you'd get, like, the 0.001% picking on, like, the 0.01%.
Right.
It's just, it's so ridiculous, but yeah. So, all right, any last words you want to give to people on...
No, I think I might have talked myself hoarse. I could just keep going. So I should probably stop.